the situation in Kashmir was bad enough already before August 2019, and of course it's worse since then. Notwithstanding the fact that Prime Minister Modi promised that the reasons he did all these things, revocations of the autonomous status of Kashmir, will be to bring about peace and development to Kashmir. But obviously, that's just a big fat lie, and no one's fooled by this, including people overseas, and so the situation has simply got worse. And the more I look at it, I've been covering Pakistan issues for a very long time, for the last 40 years, and of course I've looked at relations between Pakistan and India and Kashmir and Afghanistan, looking at the whole geostrategic situation. And the fact that after 75 years, as you so correctly stated, that the Kashmir issue still hasn't been resolved is just utterly unacceptable. It's unacceptable for both countries, but particularly for Kashmiris. They're the ones at the receiving end of the difficult issues, particularly in Indian-occupied Kashmir. And so I've been thinking about it a lot, and I've thought about a possible plan as to how to break that Gordian knot that is this festering issue of Kashmir. And I know that it's a bit controversial because I'm going to make a suggestion about how to fix it. But after 75 years of failure in diplomacy, in regular diplomacy, I think it's about time to try to think outside the box to try to resolve Kashmir. Because if we can resolve Kashmir, I fundamentally believe it will not only help bilateral relations between Pakistan and India, but it could certainly help not only the Kashmirs, that's a given, but also it could actually release a lot of this wasted money and resources between the two countries, between Pakistan and India, and help a lot of Pakistanis and Indians out of poverty. This is just simply background. So what I'm suggesting is a 3-step plan to try to resolve Kashmir. And just let me say the whole thing, and then I'm more than happy to later on try to answer some questions. First step would be for both Pakistan and India to co-sponsor a UN General Assembly resolution to refer the whole Kashmir issue to the International Court of Justice, to have an advisory opinion as to the legal status of Kashmir. As we know, there have been many UN Security Council resolutions over the years, and we all know it still remains disputed territory. But let's get an international advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice exactly on the status of Kashmir. That would be a good way to set the scene between Pakistan and India. It would set the tone for future discussions and for framing negotiations. If they can do this together, it sets the tone. This is really important, I think. Now, before I go ahead, this is really important. None of this will be possible, what I'm going to say now, unless there's the political will to try to resolve it. Now, I do know that on the Pakistani side, there is a political will. General Bajwa just a few days ago said that he would be willing to sit down with the Indians to talk about Kashmir. Okay, I'm not particularly keen on what he wants to talk about, but that's not the point. If we just start sitting down and talking, then we've got something to build on. On the Indian side, I'm not so sure how keen they are, but you need to have the political will. If the political will is there to fix it, it is fixable. The second step, so first step is get an advisory opinion. The second step will be for India to reinstate Kashmir's autonomous status, revoke the draconian laws that they've imposed on the Kashmiris, and particularly the UAPA laws, in which, as you know, people can be locked up for 2 years without even being tried, and release all political prisoners who haven't even been tried yet. They should all be released. That would indicate that India is actually serious about wanting to resolve it, the whole Kashmir issue. The bottom line is, and this is really important as well, is that Kashmir for a very long time was all about basically the piece of real estate. Which bit of Kashmir belongs to whom? That is no longer the issue. That is not the most important issue. The most important issue is the self-determination of Kashmiris. They must have a right to decide who they want to live with or independently. And I'll get to that, okay? And the only way to decide this is through a referendum, as agreed to in Resolution 47 of 1948. But what I'm suggesting here is two differences. One, I would suggest that because of the religious mix of the different parts of Kashmir, both the Pakistani bit and the Indian bit, there should be a referendum, and the whole of Kashmir should not be counted as just one, but 5 different areas, political units for electoral reasons and purposes. And they should be, as we know, Gilgit-Baltistan will be one, Jammu, Azad Jammu Kashmir, another one, Kashmir Valley, Ladakh, and Jammu. 5 different parts for the purpose of counting the referenda that we would have, okay? And the second big difference is each one of those parts would have 3 options. Go with Pakistan, go with India, or independence. All 5 parts would get those same choices. So those 5 parts would have the referendum held at the same time, but it would be counted separately. That's now, and the very important bit here is that for that option that they pick, whether it's one of those 3, there would have to be a 60% majority. We don't want to have a Brexit on our hands, okay? It has to be 60%. So it's a solid majority. If none of the 3 options get 60%, then the top 2 options then go for a runoff, okay? Now, it is quite possible that all the different parts of Kashmir that we have now in Pakistan and in India may wish to stay put. It's quite possible. We don't know. The Indians haven't been so keen in having pollings to find out where would you like to go. But the fact is, if there is one that may want to go, that obviously will be the Kashmir Valley. If they want to go for Pakistan, that probably is the only one that would want to move, I suspect. But it's possible they may not want to. We don't know. So we'd have to look at that. But at least what we can say, and this is why it's so important, no one can say later on, oh, we didn't have an option. Why didn't you ask for independence? That option. No, everyone will have the same 3 options. Now, to make all this facilitate this discussion, we would then have a facilitator by the name of the Commonwealth Eminent Persons Group. And the reason I picked the Commonwealth Group is because both India and Pakistan are members of the Commonwealth, as we know, and they would be probably the most impartial, international group that could assist simply in facilitating the discussion, because there will be a lot of differences between the 2 countries. And I'll talk about that later. Now, to make sure that this whole process actually works and you don't have one or the other deciding what I'm putting out, there will be the demilitarization of all of both Indian administered Kashmir and Pakistan administered Kashmir. Demilitarization, leaving only a military force simply big enough to help with law and order. And all this would be, all this would have to happen before we have the 5 referenda, or the one bit in the 5 different bits. And then this would be all supervised by a UN peacekeeping operation that will be there to check, monitor demilitarization, supervise the referenda, and supervise the implementation of the results. all the 5 parts of Kashmir would remain demilitarized after the referenda, regardless as to which way they went, Pakistan, India, or independence. And what is important as well is that there will be a UN peacekeeping force that would remain there, which could be renewed, but that would have to be then agreed to by the UN Security Council. The Security Council members would guarantee the inviolability of all borders of Kashmir. Now, as I said, now that there's one unknown that would have to be looked at, and that is the role of China in all this. And the reason I mention this is because China really doesn't have a stake in the very most important bit of what I'm talking about, which is about the self-determination of Kashmiris. But it has a stake on about the borders with India. So what would be required would be negotiations between India and China to negotiate some sort of resolution on the border. I'm not going to go into the details now. That would be something that would have to be negotiated. And whatever comes out of that negotiation could eventually feed into this whole three-step plan. To make the sugarcoat all this, and to make sure that India and Pakistan and the Kashmiris are keen on all this, there will be guaranteed massive economic assistance by the international community. And to get this economic assistance, there would have to be free movement of people, capital, and goods between all parts of Kashmir, regardless as to how they went, independence, Pakistan, or India. Now, this will be a very, very big gamble for either Pakistan or India to go for. So to be able, before going straight into it, I'm suggesting a 2-step process. First, through back channels that are credible, trustworthy. Separately, they would approach the 2 prime ministers, Indian and Pakistani, and approach them and ask them whether or not separately they agree in principle with this plan, just in principle. If they agree with that, then there would be a 1.5-track dialogue that would involve Indians, Pakistanis, and Kashmiris, and members of civil society, academics, retired military officers, retired public servants, who would sit down, look at this plan, and develop it, because it needs to be fleshed out. But they would just have to discuss this. And maybe at the end, they would be helped by the Commonwealth Eminent Peoples Group. And perhaps at that point, they may realize, after maybe discussing this, and incidentally, the discussion would have to be in a third country, probably hosted by a think tank. It will be secret, no media to be involved in it, and there's no deadline. It could take a year, 2 years, or whatever it takes. So it is just like the Oslo discussions they had over Palestine. So there is no leakage, and it's just them talking about it. And at that point, they may realize, after talking together, just them, separately, secretly, they may come to the realization it's not doable. It's just simply not doable. But at least they will have tried. But if they do come up with something, a plan, a roadmap, with that roadmap, they would go back to their separate governments, Indian and Pakistan, and say, look, this is what we've agreed to. Do you agree with this? And then the 2 prime ministers could say yes or no, or they could say yes in principle. And then with that, the real official negotiations could begin. That's the plan. And we all know if something like that could be pulled off, it'd be fantastic. It would be in everyone's interest, to start with the Kashmiris, for Pakistan, and for India. And I think a lot of good things would come out of that. I'll leave it at that, but that's what I'm putting on the table. Thank you very much.